I'm Callista.
And I'm Teresa, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime.
We're continuing our theme of female killer nurses. Lest you think they're a relatively recent phenomenon, we're traveling back in time to the turn of the 20th century to prove that sadistic healthcare workers have been around since before any of us would have been comfortable receiving the type of care with which doctors at the time were familiar. Today, we're talking about the appropriately sinister sounding Jolly Jane Toppan.
It was 1887, and Amelia Phinney was recovering from surgery of a uterine ulcer at Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts. As she lay awake from the postoperative pain, a nurse appeared in the darkness. This nurse, Jane Toppan, gave the 36-year-old patient some kind of drug that thankfully made her pain ebb away. Yet, as numbness stole over her body, Amelia found herself being pulled under. Not yet completely unconscious, she felt the bed sink as someone got in beside her. Jane Toppan began caressing the patient, made immobile by the poison she had just given her. But as suddenly as the nightmare had started, it ended when another nurse came by. Her appearance forced Jane to jump out of Amelia's bed and leave her would-be victim alone. When a trainee nurse called McCutcheon woke Amelia the following morning, she was still under the influence of the nearly fatal drugs Jane had given her. Once their effects finally wore off hours later, she began to question her own recollection of the night before. She wouldn't recount the incident until she and the rest of the world learned the names of Jane's dozens of victims, a fate Amelia had only just escaped.
To find out what led up to this sinister scene and to learn about the many murders that followed, let's go back to the beginning. Jane Toppan was born Honora A. Kelly to Irish immigrants Bridget Finn and Peter Kelly. And right away, we're jumping into the joyous, murky waters of historical cases because while many documents state Honora's date of birth as March 31st, 1854, some primary sources, such as census records, list her year of birth as 1857,
Gotta love historical records.
and their inconsistencies. Born sometime in the 1850s, Honora or Nora was the youngest of Bridget Finn and Peter Kelly's three or four daughters. Sadly, Bridget died from tuberculosis, also known as consumption, when Nora was still very young. And humor me because I had to put in a brief interlude to talk about TB here. In 19th century New England, the spread of tuberculosis was catastrophic. It wiped out whole families throughout the Northeast. In less than 2 decades, between 1786 and 1800, consumption killed 2% of the New England population.
Along with lower life expectancy, a lack of indoor plumbing, questionable medical treatment, and seriously lacking food safety procedures, people also had to worry about getting infected with TB.
I like learning about the past, but I don't want to live in it.
100%. The disease itself was no less horrifying. Those who contracted it died slowly as their coughs turned bloody, their skin went ashen, and their weight plummeted. It was so called because patients were being consumed as they wasted away. Jesus, that's rather on the nose, isn't it?
Best people know what they're in for, I guess.
I guess. Since doctors couldn't explain why residents were dropping dead, villagers turned to the supernatural for an explanation, thinking that those who had already died from consumption were coming back to life to kill those they had left behind. Some even call these vampires bacterium with fangs, which sounds horrifying.
I'm literally picturing a tiny bacterium with two white fangs poking out.
Well, now I'm picturing that too.
Sorry.
With this belief entrenched in the minds of many, residents started exhuming bodies so they could attempt rituals to prevent them from rising from the dead. A famous incident of this occurred in March 1892 in Exeter, Rhode Island, when some of the townspeople took their shovels to Chestnut Hill Cemetery and dug up the bodies of Mary Brown and her two daughters, Mary Olive, who died when she was 20, and Mercelina, who was 19 at the time of her death.
These three women had slowly become sicker and sicker before dying of an unknown disease. Well, unknown to the average residents, that is, because doctors had their own, less supernatural theory. However, having watched as the women's lives were sucked out of them, people were desperate. That desperation extended to widow George Brown, whose son Edwin had fallen ill soon after Mercelina died. Worried Edwin might meet the same fate, George allowed his neighbors to exhume the corpses of his wife and two daughters. While the bodies of Mary and Mary Olive were appropriately decomposed, Mercy didn't look much different than when she was alive. Months after she had been buried, she still bled a little when her skin was punctured, and her nails and hair both seemed longer than they did when she had gone into the crypt. A local doctor who had watched the entire examination told the villagers that the recent cold spell would have slowed Mary's decomposition, but terrified residents pushed his tentative theory aside. They had seen the evidence with their own eyes. Mercy had become a vampire.
To kill this supernatural entity, they cut out Mercy's heart and set it ablaze on a rock. It was rumored that Edwin was then told to eat the ashes. You will be shocked to learn that his consumption was not cured. He was dead within months. Even though this was just one of the ritualistic exhumations that took place all over New England during this period of history, I love this. This fame helped turn Rhode Island into the vampire capital of America, which would be amusing if not so tragic.
And terrifying.
One way to stop these vampires was burning their livers and hearts, but others, including turning the bodies face down, decapitating their skeletons, or separating the legs from the rest of the body to ensure they never rose again. And this is what happens when we listen to other people who don't have a freaking clue.
Might as well throw things at the wall and see what sticks when no one has a better idea.
Interestingly, in Griswold, Connecticut, archaeologists in the 1990s found 29 sets of skeletal remains racked by consumption, grouped into recognizable skulls and crossbones. This curious case was coined the Jewett City Vampires.
It took German microbiologist and doctor Robert Koch's identification of the bacteria that causes tuberculosis in the late 1800s for these fearful rituals to fall away. Okay, back to Nora and her family. Bridget Finn's untimely death from tuberculosis not only left young Nora, but also at least two other older daughters in the care of Peter Kelly. Records indicate that Nora's two older sisters were named Ellen, who went by her nickname Nellie, and Delia Josephine. Her third older sister could have been a woman named Mary Kelly, who told the press she was Jane's sister, but as this happened after, spoilers, Jane was arrested. It's also possible she was just looking for her 15 minutes of fame, especially because documents verifying the details of her birth were never discovered.
Similar unverifiable stories about Peter Kelly popped up in the press about him being called Kelly the Crack as a reference to him being a crackpot and using his skills as a tailor to sew his eyelids together, which led to him being hospitalized in an insane asylum after he was discovered in that wretched state in his tailoring shop. There were also rumors that Peter experienced alcohol use disorder and at the very least neglected and perhaps abused his young daughters in the wake of his wife's death, resulting in their short lived residence with Peter's mother. What we know for sure, though, is that in February 1863, young Nora and her older sister Delia were admitted to the Boston Female Asylum. I'm surprised it wasn't called the Boston Hysterical Female Asylum,
Maybe that was its nickname.
which could indicate an unloving father or simply the extreme poverty that many lived in at the time. Whatever the case, this would mark the last time they ever saw their father.
The Boston Female Asylum was located in the city's south end on Washington Street and was established in 1800 as an institution that would look after Boston's impoverished or orphaned young girls by giving them a home, food, and education. The asylum aimed to better the girls they could before sending them off with middle class families searching for cheap domestic labor in the form of indentured servants. Years after the Kellys' time, by the start of the 1900s, it had transformed into a counseling and placement service operating under the name of the Boston Society for the Care of Girls. And in 1923, it was combined with the Boston Children's Aid Society to create the Children's Aid Association, which would later be named the Boston Children's Service Association.
But back to when the Boston Female Asylum raised future indentured servants. As Nora completed the chores assigned to her, she picked up a habit that would follow her for the rest of her life: lying to get what she wanted. At this stage, her falsehoods were only aimed at making friends with the girl she was living with, but later the stakes would be much higher as she committed criminal offenses. In spite of their relative harmlessness when she was a child, Jane's deception was discouraged, particularly by her new family, because a little more than a year after Nora arrived in November 1864, the respectable widow of Captain Abner Toppin, Miss Ann C. Toppin, had her application to take the young girl into her home in Lowell, Massachusetts, approved by the board of the Boston Female Asylum.
If you were also curious, indentured servitude first came to the US in the years after the Virginia Company's 1607 settlement of Jamestown, Virginia, due to a desire for cheap labor. These early settlers quickly discovered that they were ill equipped to take care of their vast amounts of land on their own. Because the voyage to the newly established colonies was only an option for the wealthy, the Virginia Company offered those without the means the option to start a new life as indentured servants.
Nice to have no options in life.
Isn't it, though? And after the 30 Years' War decimated the economy of many European countries, many workers found themselves unable to find jobs. So, one half to two-thirds of the colony's immigrant population began their new lives in America as indentured servants.
In spite of the promise of a more prosperous life, the typical terms of this agreement saw the servants working for 4 to 7 years to pay for their initial voyage, then their room and board, and finally their freedom dues, which seemed to be the resources they would need to begin their independent lives. These servants weren't slaves. They did have some rights, but they often faced strict rules and harsh punishments, such as having years added onto their term if they attempted to run away, or for women if they felt pregnant. And I wonder what the percentage of pregnancies were the result of sexual assault by their captors.
I'm guessing it wasn't low.
This system could have become less harsh since its inception more than 2.5 centuries earlier. However, it's hard to imagine that Nora had an easy time ahead of her as the Toppin servant. That isn't to say her family fared much better, though. Like Peter, it appears that Nellie was committed to an insane asylum, and Delia suffered a similarly dismal fate. She also developed alcohol use disorder and turned to sex work to make ends meet.
But there was no getting around the fact that Nora's life and name did change. And from 1865, she became known as Jane Toppan. Going by Jenny during her years at Lowell Public Schools, she was never adopted and instead continued to serve the Toppin household, a position of which she was constantly reminded, as Anne Toppin, who told Jane to call her Auntie, would spoil her biological daughter, Elizabeth, as Jane slaved away in their Centralville home. It has been said that Jane and Elizabeth were initially close, but that all changed after Anne, or the more ominous Auntie, punished Jane for acting above her station. Jane would show no loyalty toward her privileged sister later in life.
Which seems fair enough.
If she had just cut her out of her life, I would have said so too, but Jane wasn't known for turning the other cheek.
As we will see over and over again.
Yeah. With her new name, the Toppins hid Jane's Irish origins, which were looked down on at the time. This cover up also included saying Jane's parents died on the ship they took to America from Italy and teaching Jane to stick to that story and refrain from telling any of her earlier fibs.
Having graduated from Lowell High School, Jane had proven herself to be both a fast learner and a gossip who was skilled at deflecting attention away from herself and charming her way into the good graces of others. Among her ingratiating stories, as she told the doctor who would later interview her during her trial, Henry R. Stedman, she would claim that her father had spent 2 years in China before she was born. Another lie she would use to conceal her later crimes was that she was so horrified by dead bodies that she would faint upon seeing one. Dr. Stedman rightly remarked that the respectable Topham family and their proper moral and religious beliefs couldn't eradicate her deceitful disposition.
One event that marked her transition from a little liar to a wicked woman was when Jane allegedly became engaged around the age of 16 to a beau who presented her with a bird shaped ring. This engagement was short lived because not long after proposing, he went out west in search of better career prospects, which was where he fell for the daughter of his landlady, for whom he broke off his engagement to Jane to marry instead. It was said that Jane demolished the ring he gave her, and in the midst of a heartbreak she would never get over, began to indulge her darker impulses and develop concerning quirks, such as thinking that her dreams were predictions of the future. Whether these predictions ever came true or not, and I know which way I'm leaning, Anne Toppin encouraged Jane to start thinking realistically about her future by giving her $50 on her 18th birthday as a head start. Despite this subtle push, Anne Toppin let Jane continue working in their household for the next decade. Jane even stayed on after Anne died and became Elizabeth's servant, not leaving until the age of 28 when that relationship soured.
As for why this relationship soured, one reason seems to be that upon her death, Anne left Jane to plan her funeral. She left her with this responsibility and nothing else. Jane didn't have a single claim to the property she had grown up on. She would later confess that she believed that Elizabeth, who was 20 years older than her, had been the one to ensure that she was cut out of the will. In spite of outwardly remaining friendly with her foster sister, the ongoing envy she felt towards Elizabeth and her life of ease culminated in a resentment that would end in violence. But until that resentment bubbled over, Jane began to carve a path for herself, becoming a student nurse in her 20s in the late 1880s when she started at Cambridge Hospital.
And she seemed to be on her way to becoming a great nurse. Between her quick absorption of the information she was being taught and her familiarity with grueling hours, Jane was more than able to care for her patients. Her cheerfulness at work even got her the nickname of Jolly Jane. However, this was all a facade. Jane didn't really enjoy helping her patients heal. What Jane did still get a kick out of, though, was lying. But her fellow nurses were less than impressed with her outlandish tall tales that she loved to spin, particularly when this habit interfered with her job, which it often did. Jane would transfer patients to different institutions, claim they were still ill by reporting invented symptoms, and write down the wrong information, such as by falsifying their charts. At one hospital, she even stole various items such as hospital uniforms, stationery, and money. But by rolling out her skills in deception and her friends' attestations of her good character, she avoided any consequences related to the thefts.
Many of her unimpressed fellow nurses weren't going to let her get off that easily, though. They attempted to get rid of her by saying she had come in after curfew and used her meager earnings to buy beer, two things we can safely assume most of them were guilty of. However, Jane wasn't one to let a slight go. Instead, she turned the tables on them, but more successfully, as she managed to get two other nurses fired. More sinisterly, throughout her residencies, she played around with medications. She tried out different doses of morphine, a narcotic, and atropine, which is derived from nightshades and used to treat a low heart rate, overdoses, and poisoning, and to hinder saliva production before surgery. She would give her patients dangerously large doses of the drugs just to see what would happen and frequently said that there was no reason to extend the lives of old people. Wow, harsh.
That it is. Compassionate she was not. Those who heard this thought that she was joking. Why they thought it was an acceptable joke for someone who was entrusted to care for them was another matter entirely,
It seems to be an automatic impulse when someone says something horrifying to assume they are joking.
which doesn't always end well. That said, it's possible that some of them were scared of her, especially because one source mentioned that Jane's first failed attempt to poison someone was when she went after another nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital in 1886.
I'm sure they were scared of her.
I would have been. Other worrying behavior included her never ending questions about poisons and their corresponding antidotes. She also had a morbid autopsy obsession. Her behavior was so abnormal that many thought she had an opium habit. With her growing knowledge, she allegedly poisoned patients only to save them over and over again to play God. Additionally, similar incidents to the one concerning Amelia Phinney, with which we started the show, led some to speculate that Jane received sexual gratification from killing her patients and watching them die by her hand.
Just like so many male serial killers.
Sexual sadism is well documented.
Even though one doctor side eyed the unexpected deaths of two patients linked to Jane, others admired Jane's work ethic and quick mind. In spite of her mixed performance reviews, because of violating some kind of guideline, either a minor one like stealing hospital uniforms and stationery, or something more serious such as misusing opioids and other medications, Jane was fired twice. First from Massachusetts General Hospital, which she had transferred to from Cambridge Hospital, then from Cambridge upon coming back after her first termination. These terminations meant that she never even completed her training.
But a small thing like not being a qualified nurse wasn't going to stop Jane. Instead, she decided to give private nursing a go. This was an even more ideal role because it came with less supervision as the families left her to get on with her duties. Just like at school, Jane's intelligence was never the problem, and she was able to forge her nursing certificate to present to potential employers.
Smart and calculating.
I do wonder if forging documents used to be easier, though.
Oh, I definitely think so.
Yeah. Her ability to charm those who could offer her something also hadn't faded over the years, and several well regarded physicians helped Jane get new clients by giving her name to families with relatives who needed care. Despite her continued stealing, which featured Jane, quote unquote, borrowing money that she never gave back, most of the families she worked for saw Jane as a kind and professional nurse. More than a dozen different families in New England trusted affable Nurse Jane Toppan to treat their ill relatives. Yet, it was this trust that would allow Jane to get away with murder.
Over the years, Jane murdered patients for any number of reasons. It was her solution to an unpaid debt or a difficult family. It's also been theorized that she would give her patients just enough poison to keep them ill so she could continue nursing them, but not enough to kill them and end her employment. She enjoyed playing with them,
Especially when it was in her best interest.
but she wasn't looking to extend her time with Israel and lovely P. Dunham. What a great old timey name.
I know.
Whether it was because they were difficult patients or landlords or simply because they were old, in Jane's mind, they had to go. 83-year-old Israel Dunham died on May 26, 1895, in Cambridge after he had been ill for 4 days, supposedly from a strangulated hernia. His wife, Lovely P. Dunham, died a couple of years later at the age of 87 on September 19, 1897, apparently from old age. As was the case with her late husband, Jane was still in her life at the time of her death. Those were long lives back then, which of course would have been longer if not for Jane.
Too true. With no qualms about killing, at times, Jane hardly needed a reason to murder. Sometimes, simply knowing she would get away with it was enough. It may have been this simple callousness that caused her to kill 70-year-old William H. Ingram of Watertown on January 27th, 1900, who reportedly died from heart failure. As she killed with impunity and unconcern, She continued to give her patients atropine and morphine, but she also began to use strychnine as well. However, her preferred poison was morphine mixed with a lethal amount of atropine in Hunyadi water. Hunyadi mineral water was a curative first used in 1863. It's an aperient or laxative due to containing magnesium sulfate and sodium sulfate. Named after 15th century Hungarian military leader János Hunyadi, it was used to treat constipation, inflammation, and bloating. Most importantly for Jane, though, was that its bitter, salty flavor masked the bitterness of the fatal medications. On many occasions, poisoning her patients was not an impulse, as Jane would later claim, but a tool she used to increase her lot in life. We first see Jane wielding this weapon for that purpose when she killed her supposed friend, 48-year-old Miss Sarah E. Connors, the matron at Cambridge's St. John's Theological School refectory, to take her job for herself. The woman known as Myra was a patient of Jane's when she died from the vague cause of a complication of diseases on February 11th, 1900.
It would seem that Jane again had a financial motive when she murdered 70-year-old Miss Mary McNear of Cambridge. Near the end of her 2-day illness, Mary McNear, a rich widow, was cared for in the last 3 hours of her life by Jane. On December 28, 1900, she died from apoplexy or sudden death from internal bleeding, which might follow a cerebral hemorrhage or stroke and lead to a period of unconsciousness. But the beginning of the end came for Jane in the summer of 1901 when she murdered 62-year-old Miss Mattie Davis. Mattie Davis had fatefully decided to go see Jane in Cambridge to get the money Jane owed for her summer rent in Calumet, Massachusetts, on the upper cape of Cape Cod.
Jane had first taken a vacation in Katomet in 1897 when she stayed with the wealthy family of L. W. Ferdinand in the Davis cottage. The Davises also owned the hotel beside the cottage named Yaheen House, where city folk flocked in the summer. The patriarch of the family, 65-year-old Alden P. Davis, was so well known in Katomet that some residents regarded him as the founder of the village. Even if that wasn't quite true, Alden undeniably had his hand in many pies. He had previously reworked the railway system so the train would end up on the Cape. He then became its station agent as well as Katomet's postmaster. Alden also managed the general store and owned the marble business that was responsible for providing many of the local cemetery's headstones, which Alden engraved himself. He had even previously done work on the Ladden Whitney Monument outside of City Hall.
Having made fond memories in Calumet in 1897, Jane continued to come back to the Cape each year to stay the summer at the Davises' own Yaheen house. It was at the end of August 1889 that Elizabeth Toppin Brigham came to visit her foster sister in I've seen it different ways, sorry, Calumet, as Jane would later confess. She thought this was the perfect opportunity to enact her revenge on her foster sister, the woman she believed had made her life all the more difficult by cutting her out of Anne Toppin's will. But revenge wasn't the only reason Jane decided to murder Elizabeth. She once again saw it as a stepping stone on her way to a higher station. This time, she planned to accomplish this by marrying Orimal A. Brigham, her brother in law. To solve the problem of him being inconveniently married, the day after Elizabeth arrived in Catamount to see Jane on August 26, 1899, Jane floated the idea that they should have a picnic. Elizabeth had been experiencing mild melancholia, or depression as it is now known, for weeks, and Jane said that enjoying a meal on the beach might do her some good.
The two women made their way to Scotch House Cove and spent a few hours catching up as they ate taffy and cold corned beef. However, their calming day sitting on the sand was coming to a calamitous end because Jane had poisoned Elizabeth's mineral water, intending to make her suffer before finishing her off with morphine. Beginning to feel the effects of the poison, Elizabeth went up to bed early that night. When Jane called her for breakfast the next morning, she received no reply. Jane played her part as the concerned relative and nurse by running to Alden's home and pleading for her landlord to call a doctor for her sick sister. Jane may have delegated this duty, but she made sure she was the one to telegram Ormel. Ormel got on the first train to rush from Lowell to his wife's side. Yet, when he got to Katomet on the morning of Monday, August 28th, she was already comatose.
After being gravely ill for 2 days, 70-year-old Elizabeth died before the sun rose on August 29th from what the doctors ruled apoplexy as a result of a cerebral hemorrhage or stroke. As her nurse and foster sister, Jane aroused no suspicion when she held Elizabeth close as she took her last breath. When Ormel gathered Elizabeth's possessions, he was perplexed to discover that her pocketbook held only $5. Elizabeth had told him that she would bring at least $50 with her. Jane didn't have any idea what had happened to the rest of it, claiming that was the only money she knew of Elizabeth having on her. Ormel once again believed Jane when she told him of Elizabeth's wish to give Jane her gold chain and watch. His acquiescence only spurred Jane to continue with her plan to turn the grieving widower into her future husband.
And when his housekeeper, 45-year-old Mrs. Florence M. Calkins, attempted to interfere with Jane's goal of making herself the next Mrs. Brigham, Florence unexpectedly became ill. After a 3 day sickness, she died from suspected heart failure on January 15th, 1900, with Jane close at hand. But Jane didn't move forward with the rest of her plan right away. Before we tell you what happened with her would be husband, let's get back to the Davises. Over the several summers Jane spent in Yaheen House, she had amassed numerous signed notes for loans and unpaid rent. The total was somewhere in the thousands, and by June 25th, 1901, she still owed $500 to the Davises. Initially, the members of the family chose to let Jane pay it in her own time, but Maddie had finally lost her patience.
On the morning of that early summer day, Maddie firmed her resolve to take the train and seek out Jane in Cambridge. The trip would also be a chance to visit her daughter, Miss Genevieve E. Gordon, who was with her in laws in Somerville, Massachusetts. Maddie could settle the debt, find out if Jane would be spending the summer at their cottage or at Yaheen House, and see her daughter while she was visiting from Chicago. Slowed down by her diabetes, Maddie was about to miss the 6:45 morning train to Boston. Alden stepped up and offered to use his influence to have the conductor hold the train a little longer. Hurrying across the 300 feet from the hotel to the station, Alden managed to arrive just as the train was pulling up to the platform. As Alden spoke to the conductor, Maddie began descending the many stairs of the Davis cottage. However, in her haste, she stumbled and fell down the steep incline. Despite her injuries, she refused to forego her trip and the money Jane owed her. With the help of her husband and the conductor, Maddie made it to her seat.
Once the train had started on its way, a man named Willard Hill, who was in the seat opposite Maddie, struck up a conversation by asking if she was all right. Maddie opened up and told him that she was making the trip to confront Jane. Willard knew Jane and could hardly believe the nurse had acted in such an irresponsible manner as to allow her past due notes to pile up at the Davis family's expense. Bolstered by Willard's support, Maddie went from the platform in Cambridge to where Jane was staying with former city council member Melvin Beadle and his wife Eliza. However, upon finding Jane, Maddie apparently collapsed. Jane began attending to the woman who had come to confront her. Yet, Maddie supposedly died from her chronic diabetes days later on July 4th, 1901.
She's like a movie villain. Anyone anyone that gets in her way or that she owes money to or is jealous of or she just wants to die, she kills them.
That's great. It really is rather cinematic.
Jane went with Maddie's body back to Catamet. She met with newly widowed Alden and his other married daughter, Miss Mary D. Gibbs, who was around 35 years old. Her persona of personableness, as it had many times before, got Jane the job of the nurse. During Jane's stay in the Davis house, three unexpected fires broke out. but each was quickly put out with minimal damage. Then, less than a month after Jane began advising them on their ailments and providing them with medications, Mr. Davis and his two daughters were dead. None of them were issued death certificates, but each had a brief illness before they succumbed. Genevieve died on her visit from Chicago from heart failure after apparently suffering from a fatty heart on July 31st, 1901, leaving behind her husband Harry Gordon and their young daughter. Alden was next and died from apoplexy on August 8th. After around 24 hours of being ill, Mary, the last member of her family, died from an unknown cause days later on August 13th. After only 6 weeks, every one of the four Davises were dead.
Having recently spoken to Mary, the youngest daughter, who was often called Minnie to differentiate her from her mother, who bore the same name, and seeing she was in good health during her husband's absence at sea, her father in law, Captain Gibbs, couldn't understand how she and the rest of her family had just died. He started interrogating everyone connected to them about how this could have happened. Finding no satisfactory explanation, he pestered the police until they agreed to begin an inquiry. He had thought it odd that Jane escaped the tragedy that befell the rest of the household, and after the police finally agreed to look deeper, poisons were discovered in the exhumed bodies of the Davis family. After this, the police were forced to investigate the murders.
Her time as a free woman may have been drawing to a close, but Jane was making the most of it. After murdering the entire Davis family, she got right back to her designs on Ormel A. Brigham, who was both a depot master at the Boston and Maine Railroad and a deacon for the First Trinitarian Congregational Church. But unlike in the immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's death, he was no longer completely blind to Jane's true character, and it wasn't as if she was being careful. Beyond mentioning Mary's death to him by saying that Mary was frail and simply collapsed one day, he even heard a conversation in which Jane asked if poisons could be found during an autopsy after the body was embalmed. Despite her apparent worry about her past crimes, to become his nurse and earn his favor, Jane decided poisoning Deacon Brigham was her best bet. While she was caring for her would be husband, his sister, 77-year-old Miss Edna Bannister, who was visiting Lowell from Turnbridge, Vermont, also proved problematic in wanting Jane out of the house. Yet Edna conveniently died after 2 days of illness on August 27, 1901, once again from heart failure when Jane was nearby.
However, instead of eliminating anyone standing in the way of their marriage, Jane had pushed the situation too far. Ormel Brigham told the woman who had brought death to his door that she needed to leave his household no later than the end of September 1901. Her plan thwarted, Jane tried to take her own life with morphine. She was then treated for the overdose at Lowell General Hospital, but she managed another attempt inside. By the time Jane tried again, the investigation into the Davis murders was in full swing, and one of the detectives on the case had even been staying at Lowell General Hospital under the guise of a patient to ensure their prime suspect didn't get away.
That's dedication.
It sure is. I don't picture any hospitals being particularly nice back then.
Definitely not.
Unaware of this, Jane thought she was in the clear when she was discharged from the hospital. So she went to see friends in Amherst, New Hampshire. But her time had finally run out. Jane Toppan was arrested for the murder of Mary Gibbs on October 29, 1901. She initially appeared unbothered by the charges she was facing and claimed that each of her deceased patients had either died from natural causes or had been the ones to end their own suffering. In spite of her original statements, Jane would later admit to having been the one to end her victims' perceived suffering, which included killing the relatives of her recently murdered victims to permanently put them out of their misery. Just as with the elderly she abhorred, she saw those in understandable mourning as hardly having a life worth living.
After Jane's arrest, F. M. Bixby was originally assigned to represent her. Jane wasn't satisfied with his legal counsel, though, so she mailed a message to James Stewart Murphy of Lowell, a childhood friend, asking him to come help her with her defense. Born in 1860 in Quebec, Canada, James Stewart Murphy moved to Lowell in 1872 and also attended Lowell Public Schools. He graduated from Boston University Law School and started working at the Honorable Joseph N. Marshall's law office while writing articles for the Lowell Morning Times. After becoming a naturalized citizen in 1882, he was admitted to the bar 3 years later. He was active in his community and belonged to the Royal Arcanum Old Fellows Masons and Vesper Boat Club. He also had a strong civic interest, serving as Republican Massachusetts State Representative for District 22, Ward 2 for Lowell, and serving on the 1889 to 1890 session of the Common Council, then on the House Judiciary Committee in 1894, where he worked as a clerk for both the Committee on Transit and on Taxation.
So, did he simply help Jane out of a sense of civic duty? His motive might not have been that altruistic. Even though he stayed with his wife, F. Blanchard, and their family until he died in 1940, those at the time thought he might have chosen to represent Jane because of his feelings for her. But his help didn't get Jane off the hook. She was indicted by a grand jury on the afternoon of December 6, 1901, for murdering three members of the Davis family: Alden P. Davis, Mary D. Gibbs, and Genevieve E. Gordon. It seems the ruling that Maddie had died from her chronic diabetes was upheld. In attendance to hear the charges, Jane clung to the rail as the clerk's voice boomed around the room for 10 minutes. To each charge, she pled not guilty. She then was taken to the jail cell, in which she would remain for over 6 months until her trial began. Jane's arrest and trial made headlines all over the world, and when the latter finally rolled around, she was only tried for Mary Gibbs's murder. Represented by both James Stewart Murphy and her original lawyer, F.M. Bixby, Jane Toppan's trial began in the Barnstable County Courthouse in June 1902, and the jury heard how Jane gave Mary D. Gibbs 10 grains each of morphine and atropine on August 12th, which made her sick for around a full day until her death on August 13th.
The jury learned that Mary had gone out for a drive on August 12th and returned in the afternoon. Jane had also gone out around that time, but her reason was much more sinister. She had gone to the nearby town of Falmouth and bought a bunch of morphine pills and numerous bottles of Hunyadi water, the curative that concealed the bitter taste of the drugs. She also bought a rubber sheet like those that are placed on a patient's sick bed when they are nearing the end of their life. Once both women were back without any prompting from Mary, Jane told her she should have some Hunyadi water after a physician in Falmouth said it could solve Mary's sleep problems, something which shockingly the doctor never recommended since its main use is as a laxative. Jane said Mary would need to take it morning and night for a few days. Then she could start just taking it in the morning. Trusting the nurse, Mary drank all of the proffered liquid, but soon after she started to feel off. By dinner time, she complained of feeling feverish, and at around 9 that night, the morphine had begun to make Mary extremely fatigued. As the hours passed, the effects of the drugs only became stronger, and by 2 in the morning on August 13th, Mary was so tired she could no longer stand or walk on her own.
When she was put to bed, her feet were found to be freezing. With Mary making no improvements as time went by, a physician named Dr. Latter was called and arrived around 5 in the morning. After examining Mary, he said she needed rest, seemingly surmising that she was suffering from exhaustion from the hours she'd recently spent poring over her late father's papers. Despite Dr. Latter's minimal concern, at around 7:30 a.m., Jane said she was worried Mary was about to meet the same fate as the rest of her family. Her answer to this startling prediction was to get Mary some whiskey and to tell Dr. Latter she had collapsed. Jane then gave Mary at least one rectum injection of what we can only guess. Shortly after, Jane lifted Mary's eyelids, shook her head, and declared that her eyes were set. So too was the rest of her body. In fact, Mary would never move again. Dr. Ladder arrived at the house once more at 9 a.m., and he and Jane gave Mary several hypodermic injections. Again, of what? We can't be sure. Jane, who was caring for Mary throughout this ordeal, asked Dr. Ladder, who remained at the house until Mary's death, if he would be offended by her calling another doctor.
Having made no objections,
And really, why would you deny a severely ill patient a second opinion?
true, Dr. Frank Parker Hudnut came as soon as he got back from sailing near his summer home in North Falmouth. He arrived at the house about 10 minutes after 2 in the afternoon and discovered Mary lying on a lounge. Her fingers were blue from poor circulation, and she remained unresponsive when he tested her reflexes. Her heartbeat was quick and quiet, and he couldn't even tell if she was breathing until he searched for the faintest of sounds with his stethoscope. In an attempt to improve her heart rate, he gave her several injections: 50 grains of nitroglycerin, around 50 grains of digitaline, and 1/20th of a grain of sulfite of strychnine, which was historically used as a stimulant.
Gotta love the number of poisons that used to be used as medicine.
I mean, that along with using heroin and cocaine.
That too.
With no effect from any of these drugs, Dr. Hudnut asked for a mustard poultice to be put on her chest, which was prepared by the woman who had been caring for her throughout her illness, Jane Toppan. I had never heard of a mustard poultice, but it apparently has been used for thousands of years.
Yeah, ancient Greek physician Hippocrates thought they could be used for various illnesses from rheumatism to bronchitis. I wasn't sure what a poultice was exactly, but it makes use of a carrier like oatmeal or bread to trap the heat. The carrier is mixed with the mustard and put inside of a towel to be placed on the patient's chest. It was often used in the early 20th century for coughs or prolonged pain, as opposed to a mustard plaster, which consisted of mustard paste spread on the inside of some kind of dressing, which was apparently the antidote to acute pain. But the mustard poultice was no match for Jane's deadly mixture, and by the time Dr. Hudnut left for Boston around an hour later, Mary was already marked for death. And around 4 p.m. on August 13th, it came for her. Dr. Hudnut later testified to the effects of Jane's preferred poisons of morphine and atropine. He recounted how a significant amount of morphine would briefly cause the heartbeat to speed up before slowing it down. The drug would then likely cause them to fall asleep. However, as the morphine continued to take effect, the victim would fall completely unconscious, a state from which could no longer be woken. As their bodies shut down, their breathing would also slow. Atropine, interestingly, would do almost the exact opposite of morphine. The two drugs would wreak havoc on the body as they counteracted the other symptoms. As for how much morphine would have been needed to kill Mary, who was given 10 grains each of morphine and atropine, Dr. Hudnut said that the average oral dose would be 2 to 4 grains, meaning that Jane gave more than double the maximum dose to Mary.
Having poisoned yet another patient, Jane's behavior became no less questionable after Mary had died. Beyond telling the undertaker that he shouldn't be stingy with the embalming fluid, which was composed primarily of arsenic, Jane told all of Mary's acquaintances, as well as officials, that the family, who could no longer contradict her from beyond the grave, would have objected to an autopsy. She told Carolyn Wood, who had known Mary for almost 20 years, that the family would have found an autopsy distasteful and that Mary had been pumped so full of embalming fluid that nothing would be found even if it was conducted. Besides, Jane was sure that Mary had simply died from exhaustion. And 2 days after her death, Mary was buried with no autopsy having been conducted. After Dr. Ladder said that Mary had died from a broken heart, Jane, not doing herself any favors in making friends or avoiding suspicion, said no one died from a broken heart. I mean, she gives zero fucks.
Which I would admire if she wasn't a murderer. Despite the initial lack of investigation, after Captain Gibbs, Mary's father in law, kept pushing the police, The bodies of the Davis family were exhumed. The medical examiner who performed Mary's autopsy on August 30th, 1901, weeks after she had died, gave samples of her organs to Harvard Medical School's Professor Edward S. Wood for chemical analysis. When Professor Wood, who had taught chemistry for 31 years, examined the samples, he found a substantial amount of morphine in both her liver and stomach. The fact that it was in Mary's liver meant it had been absorbed from her stomach before she died, which indicated that she had ingested this fatal dose within 24 hours of her death. While no atropine was detected, it requires a much smaller dose to have an effect and doesn't stay in the body long. So, in spite of not finding it, Mary's opposing symptoms matched those expected by a combined dose of morphine and atropine. For instance, morphine causes the pupils to contract, whereas atropine causes them to dilate. Jane's use of both explained the perplexing mystery of why one of Mary's pupils was slightly more dilated than the other.
In the wake of Mary's death, Jane knew concerns were swirling, so she arranged for an acquaintance to send her a message that she had to come back to Lowell, making it look like her departure, which took place only 6 days after Mary took her last breath, was in no way a response to murdering the patients who had been in her care. This ploy didn't work, though, and Jane was arrested for murdering Alden, Mary, and Genevieve on October 29th, 1901, in Amherst, New Hampshire, where she was staying with friends George Nichols and his sister, General Johannes H. Whitney. The arresting officer later testified that a significant amount of morphine was found in the system of each exhumed body, despite the various causes from which they had previously been thought to have died. He also remembered that when he went to interview Jane in jail on November 14th, she maintained her innocence but said she had nothing left to live for. Perhaps her failure to make Ormel her husband, in spite of the murder she committed to make it happen, opened the old wounds caused by her teenage heartbreak.
But her heart wasn't what needed to be evaluated. And while Jane was still on remand, in the spring of 1902, three different doctors who graduated from Harvard Medical School and specialized in mental illness, Henry R. Stedman, George S. Jelly, and Hosea N. Quinby, determined that she was insane, which was the argument later made by her defense. Dr. Stedman, who had studied mental illness since 1879, testified that on April 5th, 1902, Jane first admitted to poisoning Mary Gibbs with morphine and atropine during her third interview with the doctors. And after four separate interviews of around 5 hours each, Jane confessed to giving her these drugs with the intent of murdering her. Dr. Stedman believed that she was insane at the time of the murder and would remain so due to the disease's degenerative nature. The illness he assessed her to have was characterized by a lack of morality and self control. Beyond guessing that it could be hereditary, he surmised that it would make Jane a danger to society for the rest of her life. Dr. Jelly, who was the chairman of the State Board of Insanity for Massachusetts, and Dr. Quinby, who had been the superintendent of the Worcester Insane Hospital since 1890, both agreed with Dr. Stedman.
The insanity argument was bolstered by the fact that others in her family had struggled with their mental health, namely her father Peter and her sister Nellie. Although Jane repeatedly said she was perfectly sane, she didn't contest their findings in the hope that it would allow for her future release, something which hardly seemed likely to anyone else because even though she pled not guilty, she had admitted to poisoning Mary with the intent of killing her. In June 1902, after an 8-hour trial in which Jane did not take the stand, the all male jury, as a reminder from our seventh episode on Lizzie Borden, women weren't allowed to serve as jurors in Massachusetts until 1951, took only 27 minutes to find Jane Toppan not guilty by reason of insanity of murdering Mary Gibbs.
She was sentenced to the Taunton Lunatic Asylum, which had become the second insane asylum in Massachusetts in 1851. With Dr. Stedman having determined her dangerous disease's degenerative nature, The asylum would be where she would spend the rest of her days. Still, numerous people who knew her, such as her brother in law, Orimal A. Brigham, and the Brigham's physician, Dr. W.H. Lathrop, who had previously recommended her as a nurse to various unsuspecting families, didn't buy the insanity argument. As is the case with most, if not all, asylums, Taunton made its mark on Jane. She came to worry that poison was hidden in her food and refused to eat. It was reported that she, horrifically, was force fed while in a straitjacket. Between this and her understandably pessimistic view, and despite claims that she became one of the best behaved patients, she morphed into an old woman well before her time. And we're certainly not saying she didn't deserve to be incarcerated, just that the conditions were likely appalling.
Definitely. In spite of remaining friends with his convicted client after her sentencing and even becoming her guardian while she was held at the Taunton Lunatic Asylum, James Stewart Murphy didn't come off worse for his involvement. It has been alleged that he was the one to tell the press about Jane's many murders. Having remained a family man, he outlived his infamous client by 2 years and was buried in Westlawn Cemetery. Jane spent more than 30 years at the Taunton Lunatic Asylum, which was later renamed Taunton State Hospital, before dying from pneumonia in her early 80s on August 22nd, 1938. She was buried in grave 984 in the 34th section of the Potter's Field at Taunton's Mayflower Hill Cemetery.
Before her death, Jane eventually confessed to killing a minimum of 31 patients during her 20 years of nursing, but she might have killed more than 100 total patients. Prior to setting foot in the Taunton Lunatic Asylum in 1902, she said, "It would be safe to say that I killed at least 100 persons." She also admitted she could easily have forgotten other murdered patients. She had killed so many, after all. It will come as a surprise to no one that she never showed any remorse. Because many of the victims' families didn't want their names linked to Jane's, or to go through the trauma of their loved ones being exhumed and examined, the actual number will likely never be known. Her astronomical body count hadn't quenched Jane's bloodlust, though, because she expressed her desire to have taken more lives before she was stopped.
But how did she get away with murdering dozens of patients for 2 decades? Beyond the trust we place in healthcare workers that all the women we have talked about so far exploited, Jane Toppan lived in the same time period as Lizzie Borden. So it's not hard to believe that the sexism that led to Lizzie being acquitted of double murder allowed Jane to kill over 30 victims. After all, she was just a woman, one who had chosen a suitably caring profession. Thoughts of abusing that position would surely never cross her inferior female mind. Back then, only men were typically assumed to be capable of criminality. But Jane was no ordinary woman. Her lack of a husband and children made her pitiable. She had failed to fulfill, it's hard to read that. She had failed to fulfill her duty of finding a husband and having children, then raising them in a respectable home in which she was the pillar of morality. Having not achieved her life's purpose, Jane was forced to find other things to occupy her. She said in her confession that if I had been a married woman, I probably would not have killed all of those people. I would have had my husband, my children, and my home to take up my mind. She further excused the murders by calling it a compulsion she was ill equipped to resist.
And I could buy this line of reasoning given the theory of killing as an addiction that we talked about in our 14th episode on Elizabeth Whitelaufer, if Jane hadn't often killed to improve her station. Those weren't spontaneous murders, they were calculated. Coming from a more salacious angle, quite a few sources played up her potential sexual motive by claiming that there were numerous instances like the one with Amelia Phinney, where Jane climbed into her patient's bed and caressed them to receive sexual gratification as she watched them die by her hand. With the lack of hard evidence showing this to be a pattern, I think that's mostly sensationalism.
I mean, since proper society mostly viewed females as without sexual desire and only having sex for procreation, it seems like it was a way to differentiate Jane from societal norms and sell papers, obviously.
I think you're completely right about it being a way to condemn Jane while separating her from other women, a way of maintaining the status quo by implying that quote unquote normal women would never act like that. In my opinion, it's much more likely Jane felt hard done by, given her history as an indentured servant and being jilted, so she thought she was entitled to help herself by murdering for her own gain. Although her lack of empathy for the elderly and the fact that she continued killing once she knew she was under suspicion point to a possible personality disorder like Dr. Stedman claimed, and saying she had a lack of morality and self control. While I certainly agree she would have gone on killing if she hadn't been locked away, I don't think she was insane in the sense that she didn't know what she was doing was wrong. Otherwise, why would she have tried to hide her involvement in Mary's murder?
It seems hard for people to grasp that someone can be intelligent, intentional, sane, and a murderer.
You can be sane and a bad person. Those things aren't mutually exclusive.
True. Leaving Jane's motive behind and coming back to how she got away with it for so long, sexism wasn't the sole cause for Jane's long run. In what will come as a shock to no one, medicine and science were far less advanced at the turn of the 20th century than they are today. Unexpected deaths were much more common. Infection was rife, after all, and sometimes all doctors could do was make their best guess as to the reason why. For instance, most of Jane's victims were thought to have died from either apoplexy, like signifying a stroke, or possible heart failure. The fact that poison didn't cross anyone's mind was because of what we saw in Mary Gibbs' case. Morphine and atropine, Jane's weapons of choice, cause opposing symptoms, which makes identifying them as the culprits that much harder.
Beyond Jane's access to widely accepted drugs, poisons were easily accessible. Not only did reputable doctors like Dr. Hadnut use a sulfide of strychnine sparingly, but Jane had no trouble getting her hands on it when experimenting on her patients. She didn't even have to flash her falsified nursing certificate. She could have walked into any druggist and been on her way with the deadly substance in a matter of minutes. In the end, Jane herself admitted that she was likely caught because of having killed too many patients in too short a period. We can't forget that within 6 weeks, all four members of the Davis family died, and Jane was responsible for at least three of those deaths. With Jane hoisted by her own petard, that's where we're going to leave it. Next week, we'll be continuing our series on female killer nurses when we discuss the case of Heather Presty.
All the sources we use for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or theme for us to discuss, feel free to email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at Terrifyingly Typical Podcast on Instagram and at Terrifyingly Typical Pod on TikTok. Leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought of the case. We'd love to hear your opinion.
See you next week.